Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel against Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Aleph Amin Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch on Daf Kuf Pei Amid Beis in the middle of Siman Shin Lamed Vav Sif Gimel. We're on the bottom line by the words of the Ramah Haga. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Beis Yisrael Hanisunim Batzara Bashivya Haimdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachim Aleim V'Yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Be'Afela La'Ira Mishibur L'Geula Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amein. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Esther Fradel Bas Chana, Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka Bas Shira Leah, Chava Hadassah Bas Serel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, and Gila Shifra Bas Ilan Udal. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayle Yisrael. So, yesterday in Sif Gimel, we learned about the problem of somebody who is eating, let's say, outside in the backyard. The words of the Mechaber were somebody who's eating in a gina, somebody who's eating in a garden, and we said that you're not allowed to pour out water, because if you pour out water, so then even though you're not mechaven to make the grass or whatever's there grow, it's a psik reisha. When you pour water on growing things, they're going to grow. Now, based on that, says the Ramah Haga, V'lachein, therefore, based on this halacha, toiv lahachmir, it is good to be machmir, shaloi lechol beginois, that you should not eat outside in a garden, im yishtamisham imayim, if you're going to be using water or other types of beverages that can make things grow. Says the Ramah, it would be proper to be machmir, not to eat outside in a garden. Because the Ramah says it is difficult to make sure that you're not going to spill anything onto the ground and then make something grow. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Oiskot Lamed, V'lachein tov lahachmir. Kosav Taz, the Taz writes, when you have a very sizable outdoor garden of some kind, where it's more than, he says, 70 amas, we're going to see Mirz Hashem shortly when we start learning Chelik Dalid and we start learning the halachas of Erevin. When you have a very sizable piece of property, something that is 70 amas and 4 tvachim by 70 amas and 4 tvachim, so it's approximately 140 feet by 140 feet, even if it is surrounded by a fence. When you have a gina sheyesh ba yosem mishiva mama, the heavy carmelis, such a large piece of property could be considered a carmelis. And this goes into the question of a karpev shalihukaf ledira. If you have a park or you have a garden and there's no house in it, and it's surrounded by a fence, so you would be tempted to look at it and say, well, it's surrounded by mechitzas on all 4 sides. It's a rishus hayachid. Now, you're right that midaraisa it is a rishus hayachid, but midrabanan this is something that would be called a karpef, and it's a karpef shaloi hukaf ledira. Since it doesn't have a house in it, it is not surrounded by a fence. It's not hukaf ledira. It's not surrounded for residential purposes. And a karpef shaloi hukaf ledira gets a din of a carmelis. What's a carmelis? A carmelis is a rishus derabanan. Even though technically it's a rishus hayachid, it's certainly not a rishus harabim, but it gets a din of a carmelis, and you're not allowed to carry dalan amas in a carmelis. Therefore, the Taz says, when we're talking about eating in a gina, realize the begina sheyesh ba yosem mishiva mama. If you're talking about a sizable gina, it's more than 70 amas and 4 tvachim by 70 amas and 4 tvachim. To have a carmelis, it gets a din of a carmelis. V'laloi mahani b'shum hekif, and surrounding it with a fence doesn't help. It doesn't allow carrying inside that area because it's a karpef shaluhukav ledira. Then anyway, you would have to be careful about eating. You wouldn't be allowed to eat in such a karpef to have asaba tilta larba amas, because you're not allowed to transport anything 4 amas in such a gina. Ad kan l'shoynoi ulefizem. And based on that, says the Mishnah Berurah, Filu beginas chaveroi yesh li zoher. You would have to be careful, even if it's not your gina. What the Mishnah Berurah is alluding to when he talks about ginas chaveroi is what we learned yesterday. We said that if it's not your gina if you don't care whether or not anything grows, so it's a psik reisha d'loy. There are those that said, okay, then you can eat an agina because even if you spill water, it's not a problem. It's a davar she'ein miskaven. You're not watering anything to make it grow. Even though it's a psik reisha, it's a psik reisha d'loy. But according to this Taz, if you're dealing with a karpev shelo hukav l'dira, and that's not a matter of dispute, the karpev shelo hukav l'dira you're not allowed to carry in. So taking the point of the Taz into consideration, if you're dealing with a karpev shelo hukav l'dira, then you can't eat in there, even if it is ginas chaveroi, because of the problem of tiltal arba ames. It's not that it's usher to eat there, but if you're eating, you're going to end up having to be really careful that you don't transport anything 4 amas inside this kabbalas. Okay, moving along to Sif Dal, the top line of Kuf Pei Aleph Amin Aleph, says the Mechaber. Yesh li zaher. We need to be careful. Milahashlich zeroim, from dropping or throwing seeds of any kind. Bimkaim yeridas geshamim, in a place that normally gets wet from rain. It doesn't mean, you know what, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah right away. Take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Katan Lamed Aleph, Bimkaim yeridas geshamim, which literally means in a place where rain falls. Return alarmar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, he's talking about a damp place. If you're dealing with a damp place that gets wet very, very often from rain, you have to be careful not to throw down seeds. It doesn't matter why the area is wet. It doesn't matter why the area typically gets wet, whether it's from rain or from a leaky hose or anything else. A place that's wet and commonly gets wet, you're not allowed to throw down seeds. Let's go back into the Mechaber, just reading from the beginning of the Sif. Yesh lizar, we have to take care not to throw down seeds in wet areas. Shesoifan lahatzmiach, because if you throw down seeds in wet areas, ultimately they're going to sprout. That's what shesoifan lahatzmiach means. Ultimately, the seeds are going to sprout. And what's the problem? The problem is very simple. If you throw down seeds in an area where they're going to end up sprouting, that would be the Isser, the Av Malacha of Zayreya. Now, in order to be for it to be Isser Daraisa, it would have to be that you have Kavana, that it should sprout. If it's a Davar she'ein miskaven, it's still Asr because it's a Psik Reisha, but it wouldn't be an Isser Darabanan, it would be an Isser Daraisa. I'm sorry, it wouldn't be an Isser Daraisa, it would be an Isser Darabanan. I misspoke. If it's a Psik Reisha, and it's a davar she'ein miskaven, so it's an issa d'Rabbanan, not an issa d'Oraisa. Be that as it may, the halacha of the Mechaber over here is you can't throw down seeds in wet areas. Why? Shesoifan lahatzmiach, because you're throwing down a seed that ultimately is going to sprout. That is the malacha of Zayreya. Now, as to the question of when exactly you're over the isser, that happens to be a machlekes haposkim. Maybe really a machlekes rishonim. Precisely when it is that you're over the Isser. There are those that hold that as soon as you throw down the seed, even though the seed didn't sprout yet, but if you throw down a seed in a place where ultimately it's going to sprout, right then and there, you're over the Isser Daraisa of Zareya. You threw down a seed in a place where it's going to sprout. That's the Isser Daraisa of Zareya. There are those that disagree and hold that you're not over the Isser Daraisa until they actually do sprout. Very big difference. If you're not over the Isser Daraisa until it ultimately sprouts, then if you throw it down, technically you could pick it up and you'll be able to head off the Isser Daraisa. But again, there are those that hold no. As soon as you throw it down, you're over the Isser Daraisa. There are also those that hold, and we'll see this in the Mishnah Berurah, that really you're not over until it takes root. Not only it has to sprout, but the seed has to root itself into the ground. That's when you would be over the Isser Daraisa. Be that as it may, the halacha of the Mechaber b'Mekayma Omedes, you're not allowed to throw down seeds in wet areas because Soifan lahatzmiach, and it would be the Isser of Zayreya. Therefore, based on that, says the Mechaber going weiter, second line down, V'im yashlich l'tarnagolim. Let's say you have chickens and you need to feed your chickens, and let's say you feed your chickens seeds. So, im yashlich l'tarnagolim, if you're throwing out seeds for the chickens, lo yashlich, make sure not to throw down, elo kishir sheyoichlu boy bayom oilo yamayim. Only throw down amount that the chickens will eat within a day or two. Make sure that you're not throwing down an amount where the seeds are going to stay there so that they're there for, let's say, 3 days, and they have a chance to sprout. If you throw down an amount that the chickens are going to eat up, so then you didn't have kavana that they should sprout, adarabba, you threw it out with kavana that they should be eaten up and they shouldn't sprout, so then it seems that the Mechaber is saying that that's okay. If the place where you're throwing down the seeds is a place where people commonly walk, mutter, then it's mutter to throw the seeds down, she'ein sofer litzmayach, because over there we could definitely say it is certainly not a psik reisha that they will sprout. If you throw down seeds on a path, on a walking path, so people are stepping on them all the time, then they are not going to sprout. So then throwing it down, again, you have no kavanah that they should sprout. The problem is psik reisha. Well, if you throw it down in a place where people walk, it's not a psik reisha, and therefore it would be mutter. And I think the same thing with the chickens. I don't think I said that so clearly. The same thing when you're throwing out the seeds for the chickens. If you throw out seeds for the chickens to eat, and you throw down an amount that they should eat within a day or two, you have no kavanah that they should sprout. You're just feeding your chickens, and it's definitely not a psik reisha that the seeds will sit there long enough to sprout, because you're hoping, your expectation is that the chickens will eat them, and therefore that would not be an issue. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in limud aleph. We did limud aleph already. Limud aleph is where the Chavetz Chaim said that when the Mechaber says bimkaim yeridas geshamim, he just means wet areas. I don't care how they get wet areas. And the problem is, he's cut limud beis shesoifan lahatzmiach. The problem is that you're throwing down the seeds in a manner and in a place where ultimately they're going to sprout. Pirush, the explanation of this is, says the Chavetz Chaim, sheyitzmachu, that the seeds ultimately will sprout. Why will they sprout? Machmas harikuch, because the seeds are going to soften from the wetness on the ground. The seeds are going to soften, and once the seeds soften, they will begin to sprout. Kederech kol tevua, like all grain, kishenoistem oisa b'mayim, when you put it in water, it softens up and it begins to sprout. Ukidlakaman Sif Yod Aleph, like the Mechaber himself is going to discuss later on in Sif Yod Aleph, about putting seeds and stuff into water so that they soften up and sprout. Now, I alluded to the fact that there is a machlokes about the Isser of Zereah. Is it the sprouting of the seeds that constitutes the Issa Daraisa, or does it have to take root in the ground? Now, the Mishnah Berurah makes mention of both. The Mishnah Berurah said first that the problem of Soifan Lahatzmiach is that the seeds are going to sprout. And if you take a look at the Sharatzion Chafav, he brings this down from the Nishmas Adam, which is the sheet of the Chai Adam. The Chai Adam holds that the Isser, the Av Malacha of Zereah, as soon as a seed begins to sprout, even if it's not in the ground, even if it's not rooted in the ground, you take a bean, you put a bean in water, it starts to sprout. The sprouting, that already is the Av Malacha of Zereah. Now he alludes to the sheet, I believe it's the Tosefes Shabbos, who disagrees, and the Mishnah Berurah says, Oy efsher, or it's possible, to Bisman Meruba Yishtarish Bakarka. There could also be another problem, and that is you throw down seeds in a wet area, ultimately they will root into the ground, and then that would be Zereah, according to the Tosefes Shabbos. Oiskat Lamed Gimel, the Mechaber said that if you're feeding seeds to your chickens, make sure that you throw down only an amount of seeds that will be eaten within a day or two. Says the Mishnah Berurah earlier, Mayim, de bizman muad kazeh, because within a day or two, lo yitzmachu. First of all, you don't have the Chai Adam's problem. They're not going to start to sprout within that amount of time. Certainly, less than 3 days, they're not going to root themselves into the ground. Therefore, you throw down that amount of seeds. Now, it's very interesting. I told you earlier in this year that there are those that hold that as soon as you throw seeds down onto wet ground in a manner that they will sprout, you're over the Yisra Malach of Zereah immediately. And even if you then pick up the seeds and take them away, it's too late. You are already over the Yisra Daraisa of Zereah by throwing them down in a place where ultimately they will sprout. Yet, over here we're saying that you're allowed to throw out a small amount of seeds for your chickens. Why? Because your chickens are going to eat them. So what? I mean, you threw them down in a manner that they'll sprout. The answer is that no. Again, you have no kavanah. When are you over the Av Malach of Zereah if you throw them down in a way that they're going to sprout? If you have kavanah that you want them to sprout, then when you throw them down in such a manner, especially and if it's a psikration that it's going to sprout, then yes, you're over the Yisud Daraisa. But again, by the chickens, you have a double reason to be makel. One is you have no kavana that they should sprout, and adarabah, you have kavana that the chicken should eat it, and it's certainly not a psikration that they're going to sprout, because again, the expectation is that the chickens will eat them. Masha Ein Kain continues the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Kat Lamed Gimel. Masha Ein Kain l'shloisha yamim. The Mechaber said you have to throw down an amount that they'll eat within a day or two. Masha Ein Kain l'shloisha yamim. But if you throw down an amount of seed that will take the chickens 3 days to eat, v'yoser or longer than that, well then you're running into trouble, because yitzbachu hazraim. Because if you throw down an amount of seeds that are going to last the chickens 3 or 4 days, so then now you do have a problem. By 3 days, they're going to start to sprout. And then when they start to sprout, you're going to be over on zereya. Now it's interesting over here. He says v'yischayv l'mafreya mishum zereya. That's taking the side that you're only ultimately over when they do start to sprout. Gam, furthermore, says the Mishnah Berurah, according to one opinion, Siman Gimel, this is a Trumas Hadeshen, Kol Shir Hashrasha Eine Elu Shloisha Yamim. The Trumas Hadeshen takes a very strong position. He says that seeds can actually root themselves in the ground within 3 days, even though we usually assume that it takes 2 weeks for something to root itself into the ground. Trumas Hadeshen suggests it could be within 3 days. Ayin Sham Bepischei Tshuva. Veda, and you should know, the Mishnah Berurah is addressing now a little bit of a tangential point. We're talking here about feeding chickens on Shabbos. Now, you're allowed to feed your chickens on Shabbos. Not only are you allowed to feed your chickens on Shabbos, you're mechuyev to feed your chickens on Shabbos. They depend on you for their food. You're mechuyev to eat your animal, to feed your animals before you eat. So yes, you're certainly allowed to feed your chickens on Shabbos. But you're only allowed to be matriach to feed your chickens on Shabbos. You're not allowed to do tercha on Shabbos so that your chickens should have food for Sunday and Monday. Yet the Mechaber is suggesting over here that you're throwing down seed for the chickens for Yom or Yomayim, for a day or two. Wait a second, how are you allowed to do that? How are you allowed to be matriach to throw down seeds for the chickens on Shabbos so that they should have seeds for Sunday? That's being matriach on Shabbos for after Shabbos. How are you allowed to do that? So says the Mishnah Berurah, V'da, you should understand. The Mairi, we're discussing a case here, to hishliches hazraim bepamachas, where you're throwing down the seeds in one shot. So you're not doing any extra tircha for Sunday. You're taking a big scoop of seeds and you're throwing it out, and there's enough there for Shabbos and Sunday. That's not a problem of being matriach for Sunday. Di'ilavachi, aser lahachil l'me'achayil, if you're threw down for Shabbos and now you want to throw down for Sunday, not allowed to do that. Then you're doing tircha to be meichin. You're doing hachana from Shabbos to Sunday. Okay, moving along to Sifhei, 3 lines down. Very interesting. Says the Mechaber, asavim. Now, asavim literally means grasses. Now, we're not really talking here about grass. Asavim sha'alu al oizen hakli milachus hakli. Growth that grows on the handle, the oizen of a keli, which literally translates as the ear of a keli. It means the handle of the keli. Growth that grows on the handle of a keli, milachus hakeli, from the dampness of the keli. Now, if you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Kat Lamed Dalet, he says kimoi, for example, shemotzoi bedli. This is very common when you deal with a bucket sheshayavin by tamid that you use constantly to draw water from a well. Shegedelin by kimin pitrios. You have growth that grows on it similar to patrios. Patrios are mushrooms. Now, he doesn't mean that the growth looks like a mushroom. I believe he's talking about moss, right? You have a keli that lives outside and it's always wet, so it's always moist and it's also exposed to the sunlight and everything else. It starts to grow moss on it. Moss is plant life. It's growing on the keli and it's growing from the moisture on the keli. Says the Mechaber, asavim she'alu al oizen hakli, this type of moss, let's say, that grows on the handle of a keli, milachos hakeli, from the dampness of the keli, chashuvim kibechubarim lakarka, it's as if it's attached to the ground. Now, the Mechaber does not mean that, oh, when we see moss growing on the handle of a keli, it's connected to the ground. No, it's not connected to the ground. What he means is, continues the Mechaber, it's like it's connected to the ground, v'atol shel chayev. And therefore, if you uproot that moss from the handle of the keli, it's an Isser Daraisa. It's a Chiyav Chatos. What is it? It's toilish. That's what it is. You're being toilish b'makom gidulai. You're uprooting something from the place upon which it grows. That's what he means when he says it's like mechubar lakarka. You're not allowed to pluck grass off the ground. Why not? It's toilish. It's not koitzer, because you don't want the grass. You're not harvesting the grass. But even if you don't want the grass, you sit down and, people, when they're sitting in the backyard and they're schmoozing with somebody during the week, sometimes they'll sit there and they'll pluck grass. You do that on Shabbos. So this is deraisa. This is the deraisa of toilish. So says the Mechaber, the same way that's toilish, because you're uprooting the grass, mimakom gidulai, you're uprooting the grass from where it grows. So too, when you uproot this moss from the handle of the keli, you're being toilish the moss, mimakom gidulai. It grows on the handle of the keli. You're not allowed to pluck it off the keli. Now, it's important to realize this is true even though the moss is not deriving nutrition. It's not deriving nutrients from the keli. If the keli is a metal keli, the moss is not growing off the nutrients from the metal. It's deriving nutrients from the dampness, from the air somehow, but it's not deriving nutrients from the metal of the keli. Well, mushrooms also. Mushrooms are not rooted in the ground. They don't derive nutrients from the ground. Yet, to pluck mushrooms is in a daraisa of toilish. Why? Because it's growing mimakom gidulai. That's where it grows. And that's where it's connected. To uproot it is Yisad Daraisa of Toilish. So too by the moss on the keli. It's Makom Gidulai. That's where it naturally grows. To separate it is Toilish and it's Yisad Daraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Hey. Very interesting Mishnah Berurah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Chayiv, Mishum Oiker Dava Migidulai. Du Toledes Kaitzer. This is a Tolada of the Av Malacha of Kaitzer. Now, we're going to be discussing very shortly flower pots. And we're going to discuss the difference between an otzitz nokuv, a flower pot that has holes in it, and those holes allow whatever's growing in the flower pot to derive sustenance and nutrients from the ground, even though it's not rooted in the ground. But Chazal tell us that when a flower pot has a hole in it, somehow the plant in the flower pot can still derive nutrients from the ground. An otzitz nokuv is considered connected to the ground. An otzitz she'eino nokuv, a flower pot that's not perforated, is not considered connected to the ground. Unless it's made out of wood or earthenware, that we'll have to see. But if you have a metal flower pot with no holes in it, then whatever's growing inside that flower pot is not considered connected to the ground, because it cannot derive yanika, it can't derive sustenance from the ground. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to be very puzzled here. Because we say that an otzitz she'enoi nokuv, right, a flower pot that doesn't have a hole, is not connected to the ground, really, if you uproot something that's growing in an otzitz she'enoi nokuv, it should not be kaitzer or toilish. And indeed, we say lahalacha that it is not kaitzer or toilish daraisa to uproot something that's growing in a flower pot that doesn't have a hole, unless it's made out of wood or cheres. But if you have a metal flower pot without a hole, and you pluck something growing in it, that is not an Issa Daraisa. It's an Issa Darabanan. It's a Gzeira, but it's not an Issa Daraisa. Now this presents the Mishnah Berurah with a problem. On the one hand, you're telling me that to take moss, I'm going to use the word peel, to peel moss off the handle of a keli is considered an Issa Daraisa of Toilish Mimakum Gidulai, because you're peeling the moss off of the place that it grows. And that's an Issa Daraisa. But to pluck something that's growing in an otzitz she'enoi nokuv is not an Issa Daraisa, it's only an Issa Darabanan. How is that? How is the moss considered Makum Gidulai, and what's growing in the otzitz she'enoi nokuv is not Makum Gidulai? How is that? So this is what the Mishnah Berurah addresses now. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'loi dami la'otzitz she'enoi nokuv. We can't compare the moss growing on the keli to something growing in a flower pot without a keli. Why? By the otzitz she'enoi nokuv, we say that if you pluck something from it, it's only an Issa D'Rabbanan, Potter. Potter, remember, Hilchos Shabbos, we're all the way at the end of Chelik Gimel here. We know this by now. Potter means Potter Aval Osir. Potter, you're exempt. It's not an Issa D'Oraisa. You won't have to bring a Korban Chatos Aval Osir, but it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. So by an Otzet She'eina Nakav, Tailish Mimenu is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Frek the Mishnah Berurah, I don't understand. If peeling moss off the handle of the metal keli is an Issa D'Oraisa, Tailish Mimakim Giduloi. So I would think that plucking something from a Otzet She'eina Nakav should also be Tailish Mimakum Gidulai. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Mishum de'ena mechuber karka la'olam. The reason we say it's not an iser da'araisa by the Otzet She'eina Nakav is because it's not connected to karka. It's not connected to the ground. Well, so too the moss is also not connected to the ground. So again, how is it that the Otzet She'eina Nakav is not an iser da'araisa because it's not connected to the ground? But the moss is an Issa D'Oraisa, even though the moss is also not connected to the ground. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Shani Hasam. The Otzet She'eina Nakav is different. And what he says over here is very interesting, and we'll see a Dirshu footnote. The Shani Hasam, it's different by the Otzet She'eina Nakav. The Ein Derech Zriyasham. It's not the derech to plant in an Otzet She'eina Nakav. But the Mefarshim, how they understand this seems to be, the flower or the house plant that's growing in a flower pot, that's not natural. It's not growing in its natural form. Naturally, that plant would grow outside in the ground. It's only growing in the flower pot because a human being decided to plant it in a flower pot. Okay, and, says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not the derech. It's the derech to plant things in perforated flower pots. And indeed, if you take a look nowadays, I dare to say that 90% or more of flower pots have holes in them. Either so that the water should drain out or what have you, but it is the derech to plant in flower pots that have holes. It's not the derech to plant in flower pots that do not have holes. So it's not natural, it's only man-made, and you're doing it in a way that's not the derech. Therefore, you can't call it makom gidulai. If it's in a perforated flower pot, so then you could call it makom gidulai, because that's normal. That's what's normally done. Since it's the derech, it's normally done, that could be viewed as makom gidulai. But a flower pot without a hole, it's not normally done that way. You can't call it makom gidulai. The shani asam dein derech zvir masha'enken hacha the ikar gidulan kain. By the moss, that is the way it naturally grows. So you're right, it's not connected to karka olam, but it is makom gidulai because that is how moss grows. Moss grows on damp things, and that's natural. So it is makom gidulai. There is a Dirshu footnote here, number 24, that says, Ubizmanenu, nowadays, Shaderech lintoyat smachim ba'otzet she'eino nakav. They say over here that apparently nowadays it is the derech to plant in an otzet she'eino nakav. You know, I'm telling you, 95+% of the flower pots that I've ever seen are otzet nakav. They're not otzet she'eino nakav. Kigoyin pirchei noi, yuchedoima, pretty things. See they the guy in Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal Shatol Shami Otzet She'eino Nakav Chayiv Chatos. Reb Shlomo Zalman Zatzal Taka said that nowadays it's the derech to plant in an Otzet She'eino Nakav, and therefore if you uproot something from such a flower pot, it would be an Issa D'Oraisa. Sharei Kain Derech Gidulam. Okay, let's go weiter here in the Mishnah Berurah. V'hu adin ha'toilish kishois mehizmi v'higi. Now, hizmi v'higi are thistles and thorns. Kishais, a lot of people translate kishais as hops. I don't believe kishais over here means hops because this is simply not the way hops grow. He says over here, somebody who uproots kishais from these hizmi and higi, thistles and thorns, pirish koitzim, even though the kishais are not rooted to the ground, he brings this down from the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. What he seems to be referring to here is some kind of a parasite. You have a parasite that grows on a plant. Kishais are hops. When we talk about hops are like cones that grow on a particular kind of plant. They look sort of like pine cones. And they grow on a plant, and inside there are seeds. Those seeds are what's used, what we call hops in beer making. That's how hops grow. These kishais are some kind of a parasite that grow on a plant. So the plant is rooted to the ground. The parasite is growing on the Hisbi and Higi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, to uproot the parasite, the kishois, from the Hisbi and Higi, as it is a daraisa of toilish and being oiker something, mimakom giduloi. Okay, let's move along to Sivav, 4 lines down, says the Mechaber. Asavim, which again literally means grasses, but it doesn't really mean grass. It means some kind of vegetation, herbs, some kind of plants. Asavim shetchavan ba'afar miba'oid yoim kedei sheyihiyu lachem. So the Mishnah Berurah over here in Oiskat Lamed Vav says, Kigain, for example, what are we talking about here? Asavim shehem noyim, pretty plants, lamare, things that are pretty to look at, ulahariach, and to smell, umimalin kad ofar, so they would fill up a jug of dirt, lach, moist dirt, v'toichvin oisay l'soichai. He brings this down from Rashi. So you have some kind of pretty plants or aromatic plants, and you want them in the house for Shabbos, but you want to keep them fresh. You don't want them to shrivel up and die. So you take a jug, you fill them with dirt, you take these pretty plants, and you stick them into the moist earth so that they should stay fresh on Shabbos. Let's just finish this Mishnah Berurah. For who adin, the same halacha would apply. Im toichvan bakarka kevin she'ena mechavin sheyesh Dirshu sham. It doesn't have to be that you stuck them into a jug full of dirt. It could be that you stuck them outside into the dirt in order so that they should stay fresh. So again, what are we talking about here? We have pretty plants or aromatic plants. They've already been plucked. They've already been separated from the ground. Now what you want to do is you want to stick them into moist earth so that they should stay fresh for Shabbos. And according to the Mishnah Berurah, he's mentioning 2 ways you could do this. You could do this the way he learns the Mechaber, that the Mechaber is suggesting that you take a jug, you put in damp, moist earth, and you stick it into the moist earth in a jug. Or it could be that you stuck it into the moist earth outside. Okay, so now let's go back into the Mechaber. So these are savim, these pretty or aromatic plants that have already been separated from the ground. Shetchavan ba'afar miba'oid yom. But now you're sticking them into moist earth miba'oid yom on Erev Shabbos. Kedei sheyulachim. What's the intent? So that they should stay fresh. The intent was not to plant them. The intent was that they should stay fresh. Muter le'echais ba'olim ulahitzion. On Shabbos, you're allowed to grab them and pull them out of the dirt. And there's no problem here of toilish. Why is there no problem of toilish? Well, first of all, they didn't take root, like the Mechaber says now. V'hu shaloi hishrishu. Of course, this is only mutter if they didn't take root. If they took root, you have a problem. Even in an otzet she'ein nakuv, you would have a problem. Because even in an otzet she'ein nakuv, if they took root, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Right? If it's an otzet nakuv, it would be an issa d'Oraisa. So this heter of the Mechaber, that you're allowed to uproot them, is only, says the Mechaber, if they didn't take root. V'hu shelo yishrishu. V'gam, and there's another caveat. V'gam tzarich she'ena roitza b'hashrashasan. Also, it has to be talking about a case where when you stuck these grasses or plants in the ground, your kavanah was not to plant them. Your kavanah was only to keep them fresh. Avalim niskavan l'zriya. But if you took these beautiful herbs, aromatic spice plants, and you took them and you stuck them into the dirt with the kavanah that you want to plant them, then even if they didn't take root, you're not allowed to uproot them on Shabbos. Osir. But osir b'derabbanan. Why? That's Gzeira. So again, let's just go over the halacha that the Mechaber is telling me here. You have pretty or aromatic plants. They have already been picked. They were picked before Shabbos. They are not attached to the ground. You want to keep them moist for Shabbos. So you take them and you stick them into a pot with moist earth. Or you stick them into the ground where there's moist earth. What's your kavanah? To keep them fresh. Your kavanah was not to plant them. Your kavanah is just to keep them fresh. Now on Shabbos, you want to pluck them. Why do you want to pluck them? I don't know. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say you want to smell them. For whatever reason. Now you want to pluck them. The Mechaber says you're allowed to pluck them with 2 caveats. Caveat number 1 has to be that they didn't take root. If they took root, you got a problem. But if they didn't take root, and if you just did this on Friday, they didn't take root. If they didn't take root, it's okay. You can pluck them. Caveat number 2, it has to be that when you put them in, your kavanah was only to keep them fresh. It can't be that your kavanah was to plant them. If your kavanah was to plant them, then I don't care if they didn't take root. You still can't pluck them. Why? That's Gzeira. Once you had kavanah when you put them in to plant them, now there's Gzeira, a din derabanan, is derabanan, that you can't go pluck them on Shabbos. Now, against that backdrop, let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut limud vav. You put them in over here, kadeshi yulachim. Oh, we did this already. Let's go to Ois cut limud zayin. Le'achois ba'olim. You're allowed to grab hold of the leaves, and you're allowed to pluck them im roitza lahariach behem, if you want to smell them. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to address another point here. L'chayra, when you pull these plants out of the dirt, l'chayra, you're coming up against another problem. And that is that when you pull these plants out of the dirt, you're going to move around the dirt. Now the dirt, l'chayra, is muktzah. So do we have a problem here? That you're pulling out the plant and you're moving around the dirt? You're being metaltal muktzah? So that's what the Mishnah Berurah is going to address here. He says, the Mechaber says that you're allowed to do this. V'loi mitzarchinan lei, and he did not require linoitz v'lishloif be'erev Shabbos, that on Erev Shabbos you have to stick the plant in and then pull it out again. V'lachsar v'linoitz, and then stick it back in again. Ad kidei laharchiv mikoim moishava ba'afar. Pull it out, stick it in, pull it out, stick it in, until you make the hole that they're going into wide, ad shelo yazis ha'afar b'shlifasei b'Shabbos, so that you shouldn't move the dirt when you take it out on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, note, the Mechaber did not require that. The Mechaber just said you could stick it in before Shabbos and you could pull it out on Shabbos. He didn't say that before Shabbos you have to make sure to stick it in, pull it out, stick it in, pull it out, stick it in, pull it out, until you have a nice wide hole, so that now you know that on Shabbos when you pull it out, it's not going to be a psik reisha that you're going to move the dirt. He didn't say that. Okay. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah? Because ta'afilu yazis ha'afar, because even if on Shabbos you do move the dirt, less lanba, we don't care. Why? Well, at the end of Chelik Gimel, you should already know the answer to this. Why? Sharei einu metaltal la'afar b'yadav. You're not directly moving the dirt, right? El al yedei ha'asavim. What is this called? Tiltal min hatzad. You're doing tiltal min hatzad. This is indirect movement of the muktzah. You're moving the muktzah dirt through moving the herbs or the plants, whatever they are. So it's tiltal min hatzad. And it's tiltal min hatzad l'tzayrich davar mutter. Tiltal min hatzad l'tzayrich davar aser would be aser. If you were indirectly moving the dirt because you want to move the dirt, that would be a problem. But that's not what you're doing. You're indirectly moving the dirt because you want the plant. The plant is a davar mutter. So it's tiltal min hatzad l'tzarech davar mutter. It's mutter. Ve'ein ela tiltal min hatzad d'shari. Ve'ein la'el b'simen shin yud aleph b'Mishnah Berurah sif katan chav ches mashu kasav d'sham b'shem ha'achreinim. Over there, we discuss what if you stuck these plants into the earthen floor of the house. Oh, then we have a problem. Why? Because now you could come to Ashvuye Gumais. Now you're going to pull it out from the ground, the earthen floor of the house. You're going to have a divot in the floor. You're going to want to go fill it up. So that's what's discussed over there. You're allowed to pluck them and pull them out. You're also allowed to take these plants and put them back into the moist dirt. And it's not considered to be Zaireya. Unless the hole already closed up. If the hole closed up, you're not allowed to stick the plant back in, because then it is mechsi kaboine. It looks like you're digging a hole, which would be a problem. It's oiseguma. You're making holes. That could be chayrish, not mechsi kaboine. It's mechsi oiseguma. It looks like you're digging holes. Digging holes is already a potential problem, and this is the Rabbanon over here of Chayrish. But one caveat of the Mechaber was it has to be that the plants didn't take root. If you stuck these plants in the moist dirt on Friday, it's before 3 days, they certainly didn't take root. If they took root, of course it would be Aser Loitziam. If they took root, it would be either an Issa Daraisa or an Issa Darabanan, depending on what you stuck it into. If you stuck it into the ground, it would be an Issa Daraisa. If you stuck it into an Atzitz Nakov, it would be an Issa Daraisa. If you stuck it into an Atzitz She'ein Nakov, it would be an Issa Darabanan. Ois cut mem, avol. The Mechaber said, but if you had kavana when you stuck it in to plant it, then it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Why? Once you stick it into the ground, and it's stuck into the ground or planted into the ground like any other plant planted into the ground, v'gam miskavid lazaram, and your kavana was to plant it, gazru barabanan. Now there's a gzeira, now it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, d'loilesi le'echlufe litloish la'acharash rasha. Now you might come to make a mistake, and you might come to uproot it even after it takes root. Let's go to Sif Zayin, 3 lines off the bottom, middle of the line, says the Mechaber. Osir, which connotes an Issa D'Rabbanan, Osir litloish afilu me'atzitz she'enoi nokov. You're not allowed to uproot something that's growing, even in an atzitz she'enoi nokov. So again, atzitz nokiv, a flower pot with a hole in it, positioned over the ground somewhere, even very high up, it's considered connected to the ground. You uproot something from an atzitz nokov, it's an Issa D'Oraisa. Says the Mechaber here, even to uproot something from an atzitz she'enoi nokov, which is not considered connected to the ground, is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Says the Mishnah cut me'amalef asur litloy shevuhu adin she'asur lahashkois hazroim shebesaycha atzitz. You're not allowed to water plants that are growing in flower pots. Va'afilu im ha'atzitz hu munach ba'aliyah, even if the atzitz is upstairs in the attic, so it's very far removed from the ground, it's still asur to go water it. Gam kein yesh isur b'chal zeh. This would still be asur. There's an interesting Dirshu footnote here. Dirshu footnote number 29. V'hazoreya ba'atzitz she'enoi nokov. If you water something in an atzitz she'enoi nokov, or you plant something in an atzitz she'enoi nokov, kasva nishmas adam va'arch hashulchan shechai mishum zareya. The Aruch HaShulchan, the Chai Adam, they say it would be an Issa D'Oraisa to plant something, even in a flower pot that doesn't have a hole. Kevin Shekal Oifid Shel Zriya, because what is the Av Malach of Zriya? They reason. When you want to plant something in an oifen, in a manner through which it will grow, that's the Av Malacha of Zriya. Hareu Av Malacha. So says the Aruch HaShulchan, says the Chai Adam, I don't care if you planted a cucumber seed in an atzitz she'enoi nokov. You planted it in a manner in which it's going to grow. That's it. It's a daraisa. On the other hand, meidach b'shas tshuva shevet halevi kasav shadas revach reinim neitashu potter. The shevet halevi brings down. He says that most achreinim seem to suggest that planting in an atzitz she'enoi nokov is only an iser derabanan. Continues the Mishnah cut me'amalef afilu him atzitz umunach b'aliyah gam ken yesh issa b'chol zeh. We did that. Okay, ois cut membeis. The chiddush of Sif Zayin over here was the Mechaber said that to uproot something even from an atzitz she'enoi nokov is an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's aser. Ois cut membeis she'enoi nokov. Ava me atzitz nokov. But how about if you uproot something from a flower pot that has a hole in it? That would be an Issa D'Oraisa, because it is drawing sustenance from the ground. Now this means an atzitz nokiv, a flower pot with a hole that's positioned somehow over the karka. If it's an atzitz nokiv that's sitting on your dining room table, that's not considered that it's a yoinek min a karka. It's not drawing sustenance from the karka. That would have the same din as an atzitz she'enoi nokov. Somehow Chazal tell us that an atzitz nokiv that's positioned over the ground, it could draw yanika, it could draw sustenance from the ground. So it's considered connected to the ground, and to be toilish something from there would be an Issa D'Oraisa. Even if it's such a small hole, where only a tiny root would be able to climb to grow out of that hole. The hole is smaller than a kazayas. But if a little root could wiggle its way through that hole, I feel that would still be an Issa D'Oraisa. Even if this flower pot doesn't have a hole on the bottom, it has a hole on the side. As long as it is parallel to where there are roots submerged in the dirt of this flower pot, it's an Issa D'Oraisa. Certainly if the hole is in the bottom of the flower pot. Okay? We didn't quite finish the page, but we're going to have to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Ches. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's refuahs parnaset sheduchim to those in need. We should be zoichet to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu amen. Be well.